recording. Yes, so that was the intro. Welcome to Hot Bananas. Thank you to students Alex and Maisie for producing that bit of animation, which is an experiment because this is a working progress type of experiment. So today is episode 8, and our topic this week is on virtues and vices. And we will be joined by not 3, but 4 beautiful guests, because, you know, 2 of them are a dynamic duo. And so a bit of an explainer also of what happens in the next hour. It comes in 3 parts. For the first half hour, we will have our guests present their social object. A fancy word is the signifier. What is it? And we'll find out. And then after each guest has presented their social object, we will have some time for some lively conversations and a bit of ooze and maybe kind of just a bit of banter. And then prior to finishing the show, we might prod our guests to ask them, so what? Like, what next? In that it's interesting to have ideas, but is it possible to make something out of it if we blend these 3 different objects together? And a reminder of our guests as appearing before us. Welcome Faris and Rosie from Genius Deals. Welcome Xavi, our very own Xavi from Kingston School of Art. And a returning guest, James Caig. Welcome to, it's good to have you back. So that's our show for this week. And I shall now pass over the mic to Faris and Rosie.
Cool. Hello. We're so happy to be here, albeit virtually. We wish we were in London and I don't know, I was going to say drinking some, we were in the UK drinking some pints and enjoying the gray skies of the UK. However, we're not. We've got instead some pink skies behind us. As you might have guessed, I am the Rosie part of the duo, and this is Faris.
Hello.
We have been nomadic for the past 7 or 8 years, since March of 2013. And our company is called Genius Deals. It is a nomadic creative consultancy. So we get to work with companies all over the world, companies and brands, and talk to them about how to ignite innovation within their organization. Sometimes this comes from workshops and training. Sometimes this comes from inspiration or helping to run brainstorms, could even be brand or business strategy. And so as we were trying to think about vices and virtues, we couldn't help but think about it through that lens. And we have a weaving sort of path to take you on today to talk about virtues and vices and how maybe they're the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, like what are they? So our social object today is going to be a story. So not really an object, a story. But in some ways, stories are the original social object. You could argue that the idea of countries and communities and societies is predicated on a shared story, the story of the Volk, the people of a place. That's what a country is, that's what a community is. It's bound together through narrative, which encodes things like values, myths, and sometimes wisdom in this case.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to tell you a story and we're going to ask you a question as we go throughout. Obviously, you won't be able to respond IRL, but maybe just for the sake of it, since we've got our other beautiful participants on screen, maybe you guys can give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down based on if you think this story is happy or sad as we're telling it. So we'll pause and we'll ask you, and people who are listening in, you can also think through this thought experiment with us.
Interactive class participation.
All right, so this is called The Boy and the Zen Master. You might have heard this story in other ways before, but come along with us on this journey. We find ourselves in a small town, an ancient village where there is a young man who is 16 years old, and it is his birthday. And he's about to celebrate his birthday. However, his dad cannot be found. His dad left the village just on a normal errand, or so they thought, And now
he's missing.
Yeah. So we have right now a boy whose birthday it is, and his missing dad, who he loves very much, because despite the fact that he's a teenager, he's still very much in his dad's world. So
yeah,
is this a happy story or a sad story? Thumbs up for happy, thumbs down for sad. What do you think? Yeah, kind of sad story.
And the villagers all agree with you. The villagers run to the local Zen master and say, "Oh, disaster has struck, very upsetting. This is terrible." And the Zen master says, "Well, how do you know?"
And so we find ourselves a couple of days later. The boy is in the village and his dad has returned. His dad has returned with the greatest gift of all time, this beautiful white horse that's so unusual. The village has seen nothing like it. And now this child, for his 16th birthday, he gets not only his dad returning to this village, but this horse that the likes of which have never been seen before.
So the villagers are all very excited and celebratory, and they rush to the master and say, "Hooray, it's all worked out well, hasn't it? It's great news." And he goes, "How do you know?"
So now we have some new context clues. Is this story a happy story or a sad story? Okay, we've got 3 thumbs up. Cool. So unfortunately, that horse stomped on that boy's foot not moments after it was given over to him as a birthday present. And he ended up with a horribly broken foot, a swollen ankle, and things were just really looking pretty dire because, again, this is an ancient village when horses are given as gifts and when maybe medical, criteria for broken bones are not to modern day standards.
Totally.
And so everyone is freaking out because, again, in these olden times, physical labor is required. This is how the family makes money, is working on farms. And this boy has just been, crippled by this, crippled by this horse. So they go to the villager, Zen master, and say, "Oh my gosh, this is so horrible.
Disaster,
we have this
right?
kid,
Disaster.
And even though his dad is back, he now has this broken foot and he's going to be unable to work, and we don't know how we're going to really help him heal." So last time, is this right now, is this a happy story or a sad story? Yeah. Right.
But the Zen master says, "Well, how do you know?"
Because here's the other part of this. The final part of the story is a couple of days later when they are just ruing over the fact that this young man has been crippled by this horse. Some militia come into the village and they're taking all available young men who can go and fight in this war. And only because this young man has a broken foot from this horse does he get to remain in the village. Is he not taken away by the militia to go and fight in this war? So is this a happy story or a sad story? I think, happy. It kind of ended on a happy note. But the point more generally is context matters. And depending on where we are in the story is what we're going to think in that very moment about the whole thing, even though we might not have that whole context.
Right. For the last year or so, we've been in a particular story, a very strange and interesting story that we're all kind of experiencing together. And one of the things that I keep thinking and annoyingly reminding Rosie is like, what part of the story do you think we're currently at? Are we at the beginning? Are we towards the middle? Are we getting towards the end? Because it's just not clear when the story is going to end, right? Because stories don't end. I mean, stories do end. Life doesn't until it does. Real life doesn't have stories. It's not narratologically constructed, but our brains have a strong narratological bias for a number of reasons to do with our desire to have control over cause and effect within a very specific linear experience of reality. But the greatest novelist of the last century in America, in my opinion, was Kurt Vonnegut, and he was refused his master's thesis because he presented the idea of the shape of stories. These are the shape of stories. He said, look, all stories have a shape. There's time, goes over time, duration. There's consequence because they're linearly constructed pieces, but also there's good and there's bad. Wait a second, that's not good. There you go. There's good and there's bad. There's happy and there's sad. And depending where the story stops dictates if it's a happy story or a sad story. Most stories share shapes. So there's a couple of canonical stories in Western culture. Boy gets girl, that's quite a good story. Boy meets girl, he wants girl, doesn't have girl, gets girl. That's a story that exists in lots of places. Man in a hole is a similar shape. Things are fine, things go very badly, you sort yourself out, back to normal, that status quo reaffirming stories. And then there's sort of Cinderella story, which is kind of a more structured up and down, which is slightly more interesting, which comes up a lot in Western culture, according to Vonnegut. Point being, depending on where you are in the story, dictates what the story's shape is, i.e. if it's happy or sad, and that's both contextual and determined by time. Now, what does this have to do with vices and virtues? Good question. I'm glad you asked. It occurs to me when I was thinking about this. Okay. Oh, okay, cool. It occurred to me.
Easier to read when the slide isn't mirrored. Right. I figured I would just help our dear viewers out a little bit. Great.
So in Christian thought, there are traditionally 7 vices and 7 virtues. Now, if you've not listened to Stephen King's very good 7 Deadly Sins podcast, which you should, because it's very good, he discusses that how in that schema, at least 6 of the deadly sins are quite good if you do them properly. Only anger is utterly destructive all of the time. The rest of them are quite useful. Pride cometh before a fall for sure, but it also gets you to do things and try and achieve and look after your family and patriotism and so on, right? So when I was thinking about this sort of Christian morality, obviously I got to very quickly, very quickly got to the realization that someone else has had this thought before, that all vices are virtues and virtues are vices, because Aristotle worked it out. Aristotle knows about this stuff. He knows about lots of things.
I'm very confused as to why our...
Is it currently backwards? Can you read this or no? Is it backwards or not?
Yeah.
See, okay, great. It's just backwards for us. I thought everyone was going to be having to hold up a mirror in order to see the session, but
we're using a lot of pieces of software to create this wonderful visual effect, and it's slightly challenging.
Okay, cool.
But Aristotle's point was there aren't 7 virtues or vices, there are 12 because more expansive, but also any deficiency of a virtue is a vice, and any excess of a virtue is also a vice. And I think that's the thing that's super interesting. It's not like this is bad or this is good. It's context matters, and too much of a good thing is bad, and too much of a bad thing is usually really bad. Context matters because things like murder are very bad, except when you're at war, where they make you a hero and the best. So being a warrior in old cultures makes you a sociopathic murderer in ours, right? Most of the time. There's still wars, unfortunately. Point being, context matters, and there are social values around ethics and morals, right? But an important framework for thinking about this is whether or not we are being consequentialist or deontological in our understanding of the moral impact of an action.
And if you want to dive into this, Faris is going to do a quick explanation, but we highly recommend the series The Good Place, which really dives into a whole lot of conundrums in this area and gives a lot more detail. However, for a quick version.
So I'm not going to do the trolley problem. I'm just going to explain these 2 things, right? So there's either inherent morality to an action. Something is either a vice or a virtue. The action is either good or bad by itself, or there is consequentialist morality. Something bad happens because of that thing, right? There are 2 different ways to think about vices and virtue. Think about morality in general. Either consequentially, the greatest good for the most people in the utilitarian sense is like the impact of your action is what matters, not your intention. Whereas in Kantian terms, deontological ethics would say the consequence is irrelevant. Action's either moral or not moral based on the action, which is a very different way of thinking about the world. To an deontologist, sorry, because it's not related to ontology, which is confusing, but it's not. A deontologist, murder is always wrong. They cannot go to war. They must be a pacifist. It's universally wrong. There's a universal right and wrong. Whereas a consequentialist is more contextually derived.
Right. They might say like, look, if we kill this one person, but it saves hundreds, then it would be worth it for this murder to happen because 100 people are going to be saved as a result. Whereas in the first instance, it wouldn't matter. That action of killing someone is already immoral. And
you're probably right. The trolley problem is a better way of explaining it, isn't it? Anyway, look up the trolley problem and watch The Good Place.
Okay. So in sort of conclusion, we think that if you wait long enough, vices actually can become virtues and potentially vice versa.
Hey.
We have one sort of virtue that we hold close to our hearts, that we kind of make it's almost like a mantra for us because we travel so often. We realize very quickly that there's one thing that you can pack that will help you throughout all situations. And it's a mental mindset, which is patience and a sense of humor. Kindles help with patients having books around in order to deal with the stresses of the world around you, maybe not coming to you at the speed in which you want. We have to have that series of conversations in our head that allow for patients to be practiced. But then we also have to remind ourselves that a little sense of humor goes a long way, and maybe don't take yourselves too seriously.
Patience was, or temperance more accurately, one of Aristotelian traditional virtues, but sense of humor seems to have missed his otherwise obviously broad gaze. So
all right, so that's where we're netting out with our little meditation, if you will, on virtues and vices, and we're looking forward to hearing from our other panelists too.
Fantastic. Thank you. Very timely advice and for what is ongoing. So in terms of where we are, just the ongoing. Great. So we'll now pass the baton to Mr. Xavi Sole. So over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was great, guys. Yeah, my social objects and topic is going to be less cheerful. But bear
He
with
says
me.
as he laughs maniacally.
Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So, yes, it's all in full screen. You can see it. Good. So, what I'm going to talk about when thinking about virtues and vices, important artist comes to my mind, which is Francisco Goya. I've chosen a series of etchings that are one of the most famous of Goya, called Los Caprichos, the caprices, let's say. I'm going to give, so basically the reasons why I chose that is because not only Goya depicts in these 80 different etchings, mainly these topics, those topics of vices and virtues, putting a lot of more attention in the vices part. But as well in the point of view that something that struck me very much from that is that we are not, the situations that we are facing today are not as different from 200 years ago. So there's certain recurrent topics that we know where history is pendular, and then things come and go and come back and so on. So I've been studying particularly these series for quite a long time, and it just, yeah, it's a striking how good is it. So what I'm going to do is show a series. It's 80 etchings. I'm not going to show them all, but what I'm going to do is to show kind of the highlights of those 80 etchings and how he was portraying mainly the vices of the Spanish society at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. So just a bit of context. At that time, Goya was the painter of the court. He wasn't an outsider. He was right in the middle of. He was possibly one of the most important painters and of the time. But let's say inside the system, right? He painted all the kings and queens and all the important and wealthy people in Spain. So by the end of the 18th century, there's something that happened that changed a lot of people. That is called the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment. So Goya, as a person that really, as a humanist and as a person that puts knowledge and beauty and art before anything else, he was just comparing his own country with what was happening in the rest of Europe. So when that enlightenment was happening, Spain was reluctant to it, was reluctant to change, right? And then they still had the Spanish Inquisition. There were the last years of the Spanish Inquisition. Religion was still very, very powerful. and he was very frustrated by seeing what was happening in the rest of Europe and what was happening in Spain at that time. And he had very good knowledge about it because he was surrounded by these people. So he wasn't, as I said, he wasn't an outsider. He was a person who was there. So in the mornings, I compare him to Batman a little bit. So in the mornings, he was kind of with the kings and queens and all the wealthy people. And at night, he was serving justice, let's say. So so let's start commenting the series of etchings, Los Caprichos, by this is not the first etching. This is an etching that is in the middle. And here we can see an inscription that it says, El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, which means the sleep of reason produces monsters. So he understands the vices in very different ways. So I found a definition of the vice that really, really matches what I want to talk about. That is, a vice can be defined as a destruction of oneself or malice towards others. So, and he, during these 80 etchings, he explores these two types of vice, let's say, a lot in depth. So, let's start with these. These etchings are, this series of etchings is structured in 3 different parts. One first part is more social commentary and seeing how the regular people, the peasants, let's say, wealthier, less wealthy, but the peasants, how they are left at their own vices and at their own superstitions and so on. Then there's a middle part that is more towards power and how the upper classes and the people of power is left at this kind of vices as well. And then the third part that is more getting into a dream-like thing with a lot of monsters, which is the embodiment of those superstitions. So this etching is kind of the break between being awake and being asleep, and asleep in some kind of a nightmare. So looking at the first part, he looks at some kind of vices, in this case, as in the hunt for teeth. And that was like, in this case, people that was killed for a lot of different reasons. There's, then there would be some people that would use the teeth or would use other parts for some kind of sorcery or some kind of superstitions of all sorts. Relationships, monsters from the high society getting to younger girls that are not as wealthy, but that was kind of the only way of going up the ladder, the social ladder back at the time. We see someone that is so drunk that is burning his own house, and that's what the etching says, and he's burning his own house. Punishment towards kids just for mistakes or something. So the reasoning behind is like, right, so it's kind of how the violence is passed from generation to generation based on how do we behave. Looking at power and how he portrayed power, he portrayed the people in charge as donkeys. And we have this etching here that says, until his grandpa. So this is the family book, and it's all donkeys, 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 donkeys. More donkeys, in this case with medicine, doctors that instead of embracing reason and science, embracing superstition and religion. Artists that are just painting donkeys, and the artists are just monkeys. More artists being monkeys to entertain the donkeys. The donkeys taking better positions and taking advantage of peasants. Monsters created artificially artificially. And what the etching says is like what a tailor can do. How can monsters can be fabricated. And then again, this come some kind of the last part, just like all these sacrifices, all these going into charlatans, and a lot of people that is listening to those charlatans. I cannot help but see Elon Musk right there as a parrot. And then scenes of sacrifices for gods and other kinds of demons. And this, which is the very last one, that says it's about time, which basically is those monsters being bathed by the light that is the reason at the end, and so on. So in order to wrap it up, you're going to ask, where's the virtue in all this? The virtue is that by betraying all these really fucked up vices, he created one of the best graphic pieces of all time. And it's a series of works that are being revisited. So if we think about things like people storming in the Capitol, Brexit, the rise of the alt-right, etc., this is not based on any reason. It's all people being left at its monsters. And I'm going to finish with a quote from Dave Trott, which is an advertising creative, that says, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed. But they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. So one thing can lead to the other.
Lovely. Lots of notes there. Thank you, Xavi. Right. So we now have our third guest, James. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Apologies, by the way, for getting up. My cat has found a way to paw at the window to be let in. And if I hadn't done it, should have been doing it for the next half hour. And then you might have seen her cutting across. Luckily, you were spared the shot from behind. Right, let me see if I can.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh, thank you. Okay, can you see my object?
Yes.
Thank you. I can't see you for some reason, so I'll crack on. So this is, I'll tell you what this is in a second. I said yes to doing this Hot Bananas edition of Vice and Virtue just because I thought it'd be really interesting. I didn't necessarily have a point of view that I wanted to share yet. So I sort of said one of those stupid things where you sort of say yes and hope that, you know, the universe comes around to your benefits. And then a couple of weeks ago, an email landed in my inbox. It was a newsletter, and it started mentioning, it was talking about forgiveness, and it mentioned this quote from this particular piece of art. This is from William Blake, who was a contemporary of Goya. Actually, he was born in 1750s in London, and he did this particular piece called The Gates of Paradise in, I think, the 1790s. So roughly around that time that Xavi was talking about, actually, where just after the French Revolution, he had a very different, opposite life to Goya. He was not painting for the court. He was not successful in any way. He toiled away in obscurity for most of his life and was sort of rediscovered in the 19th century, really, by Victorians, and is now 20th century seen as this great visionary. You may know William Blake, may know the name, you may know the hymn Jerusalem, which are his words. He was a artist, painter, engraver, poet. Lots of his work in the 1780s, 90s was engravings like this on copper. So much like sort of Goya, it was a sort of a plate. And this was called The Gates of Paradise. And the first two lines really are what struck me because of this thing I'd said yes to come and talk about vice and virtue. I'll read the first two lines in case you can't read it. Mutual forgiveness of each vice, such are the gates of paradise. I'll read the rest actually. Against the accuser's chief desire, who walked among the stones of fire, Jehovah's finger wrote the law, then wept, then rose in zeal and awe. And the dead corpse from Sinai's heat buried beneath his mercy seat. O Christians, Christians, tell me why you rear it on your altars high. This is basically a poem bemoaning the institution of Christianity, bemoaning the sort of people who wrote the Bible, who portrayed the Old Testament God as this sort of unforgiving, intolerant God, and is sort of saying to Christians, why do you worship this God? How this is a God who sort of made you, made everything men are, but now prevents you from entering heaven. And because of the very sins that he bestowed upon you. So Blake is sort of preaching here the idea of mutual forgiveness of each vice, such are the gates of paradise. The way we get into heaven really is about not punishing people for their sins, but forgiving them for their sins, acknowledging that, you know, there's bad everywhere and that we're all trying to do the best we can. It's a poem really about heaven that takes issue with organized religion. Blake, I've been reading into this, subsequently seeing this sort of line that leapt out at me and finding out that Blake was kind of made up his own theology, really. He decided that God was an inherent part of man, that man was part of God. The two were related, the two were one another, part of one another, which I think is very interesting. We'll talk about more of that in a second. But the whole thing of like the gates of paradise, it reminded me of a Bob Dylan song called The Gates of Eden. I was here talking a couple of weeks ago about the Beatles, and now I'm talking about Bob Dylan. I'm a bit obsessed with music from the 60s, so sorry. I don't know if you know the song Gates of Eden. It sort of describes a number of different, each verse is about a set of different people trying to make their way towards the gates of Eden, towards heaven, towards paradise, to try and find it. And they're all searching for paradise. And none of them find it because essentially in this song, in the Gates of Eden, paradise is something of a sham. And actually, the idea that paradise, or the idea of paradise, is like this blind belief in a sort of forgiving afterlife, is kind of like the ultimate lie, because it creates complacency. It means I can live, you know, I don't have to deal with anything on earth as it is now. I just sort of have this belief in I live a good life now, and I'll get paradise later on. But actually, the idea that's buried in this song, in Gates of Eden, is the idea that Eden really is inside. It exists in all of us. And actually, the virtue is not necessarily living a good life and punishing those who don't, but in living a life with all its difficulty, you know, facing into life as it really is, without the promise of a paradise, actually, and doing all you can be to be a good person on earth for the benefit of those around you. And actually, it says the promise of anything other than that is a lie, which is something of a sin. So we've got these two poets here, Blake and Dylan, separated by about 200 years, both writing poems about the gates of Eden or the gates of paradise. The language has clearly changed, and so too, of course, is the acceptability of what they can talk about when it comes to vices and virtues or sins and what's allowed. In fact, the very notion of what's acceptable has changed, as we've heard. You know, these things change over time. And the power of organized religion has declined quite a lot in those 200 years. So there's a lot more freedom to say what you want. You know, the context is completely different, as we've heard. But you've got these two poets who are 200 years apart, each calling out religion, supposed source of virtue, as being immoral, and each likely, probably, to get religion calling them blasphemous. So saying that they are sinning and full of vice, and basically, you know, being cast as blasphemous by the object of their poetry. And I thought this was really interesting. I thought, well, what does this all mean? And it's clearly the idea that vice and virtue is in the eye of the beholder. Vice and virtue are not absolute. They're mutable. They change constantly, totally subject to context. But also they're relative, not just to the times and the context that defines them, but to each other. Vice and virtue are symbiotic. Blake was someone who wrote about that sort of thing quite a lot. Opposites, that you can't really understand vice without virtue, and you can't really understand virtue without vice. They kind of need each other to be understood. They're counterparts, really. And his writing is full of opposites. He wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He talked about good and evil a lot. He wrote a set of poems and engravings called Songs of Innocence, and then followed it up with something called Songs of Experience. Songs of Experience was never published without Songs of Innocence. He deliberately put them together to talk about those two states as being kind of related. He talked about them on the front cover of Songs of Innocence and Experience as being the two contrary states of the human soul. So we have this, in Blake, we have this idea that these opposites are sort of defining both each other and people, because people embody both sides. And this two states sort of thing reminds me, I think it's a sort of lot about how we live now, how we always live. Our life is pretty much defined by opposites, day and night, work and holiday. Perhaps at the moment we're thinking a lot about inside and outside, two sort of opposite kind of ideas, that both of which we probably wouldn't enjoy nearly so much if the other one didn't exist. You wouldn't enjoy your holiday quite so much if you didn't have to spend a lot of your time working. And I think hearing this idea of vice and virtue and all these other forms of opposites, that each opposite needs the other. And I think this is embedded in something that Faris and Rosie talked about, which is in stories. Because I think the stories that we love the most, the stories we return to most often, are about opposites. They thrive on opposites. I know we talk about stories being beginning, middle, and end. We've heard a bit about depending on where you stop, if stories are either kind of good or bad, but every story needs conflict. Every story needs opposites to be in conflict with each other. We need a protagonist. We also need an antagonist for them to go against. Stories need good and bad. They need heroes and villains. And it's not just a sort of heroes and villains and goodies and baddies and that sort of thing. It's actually, a protagonist in a story is trying to do something. They're motivated by a goal. They're trying to win some sort of situation or get out of a problem, and they have something stopping them. That something might not be external. It might be internal. It might be their own fear. It might be their own lack of motivation. They have to overcome it. Characters have to kind of change, really. They have to sort of take on some of the thing that they're trying to beat. So you might see in stories valor and laziness. You might see hope and cynicism, and you might see love and fear. You might see vice and virtue, of course, and they're sort of part of the same story. The conflict between all of these is what creates change, and change is what makes stories. If you look at any kind of film where this is happening, you'll see this battle of opposites playing out, and it's a bit like hero and villain. It's a bit like Blake's God and Man. They're kind of part of the same thing. There's a reason Batman and Joker sit across a table from one another, and Joker says, "We're not so different, you and I," and it freaks Batman out, because there's something of Joker in Batman, and that's what he needs to overcome. If you've watched something like The King's Speech, about the king with the stammer who couldn't do a speech, he is in opposition to someone who's his voice coach, who is free flowing, but there's also greater symbolism there, where you've got royal versus commoner, Englander versus someone from the colonies. These sort of symbolic opposites are playing out sometimes quietly in films. Another one I love, opposites and conflict and fighting, is Groundhog Day, which obviously happened a couple of days ago, Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray's character, locked in this weird time. First, he's so many kind of things to fight against: the snow, time, the hick town, small town values that he's got to fight against. But ultimately, what he's really fighting against, of course, is himself. When he comes out, he recognizes the change he has to undergo. He takes on some of the things he's hated in the past, and he becomes a better person as a result. He embraces the thing that is the opposite to him. And I think that's what vice and virtue, for me, are really about. They change over time, but they also need and require each other. To win in life, we must be vulnerable. To love, we must have our own self-worth. To forgive, we must kind of forgive ourselves as well. And I think, going back to what Blake said right at the beginning, mutual forgiveness of each vice, such are the gates of paradise. We need to forgive each other, and we need to forgive ourselves. And so maybe vice and virtue is not only to do with what's acceptable at any given time, but actually what we are accepting of. And I'll leave it there.
Clap there. Fantastic. Thank you, James. Again, more notes in my piece of paper here, and I'm sure Xavi and Faris and Rosie have something to think about that. And now is the time for all of those kind of contained energy and thoughts and questions. The floor is over to all four of you to let loose and say what you'd like to say.
All right. It's funny that both of you picked etchings, right? Like, that's kind of weird. Like, of all the things that exist in the world, you both picked etchings. Like, that's odd, right?
From the same
And
time.
if you want to
Yeah.
extend that thought even further, etchings are binaries, because what Blake did was invent a mode of etching where you burnt something out rather than carved it in or something like that, and therefore the plate is always the opposite of the print, right? So it is literally itself in its creation, which is kind of funny.
And I think we talk a lot about binaries being naive and a little bit dangerous, because people are so obsessed with the idea of black and white and knowing which box something falls into. And we make sense of the world around us through judgments, through comparisons, through saying this means this to me. And so I think there's something interesting there too around it.
Yeah, I mean, binaries are Manichaean, right? So we think of it more in a sort of Eastern flavor on a spectrum of this to that. Like, too much of this equals that, rather than there being opposites. But it's the same idea, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I think you've got degrees of you're on a continuum, and I think there's something in Blake, at least, that's sort of saying, okay, you think it's opposites, but they're both in you. And then I guess the particular mix, the particular recipe that you've got going on is going to be by degrees, all right? A pinch of this or a huge dollop of that. And I think therefore then you can have a conversation about the nuance and the gray, and not just the black and white. And I'm not necessarily sure that opposites need to mean binary, as in either or.
I agree.
Like both, right?
Well, it's kind of poles, right? So like, if you think of them as opposite poles, there's still spectrum in between. And so we have this obsession with saying, like, this is a vice or this is a virtue. But again, coming back to those contextual matters, one of my favorite books is by Jonathan Haidt, and it's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And he does a number of sort of thought experiments within this book, asking people, is this immoral or is this unethical? And basically what he kind of determines is that we're divided by really geography and kind of perception as it relates to religion. So he says, people who are weird, which he defines as Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. So if you're part of that Western world, you are going to have different views about morality. And essentially the one that trumps everything is do no harm. I say, like, the example he uses in the book is a little bit vulgar, but bear with me. He says, what if a guy buys a chicken and has sex with the chicken?
A dead chicken.
A dead chicken.
That makes it better, yeah.
You're glad that it's
like a chicken in a supermarket to eat.
But he asks people all over the world, he's like, is this immoral? And essentially, like, it's a division between half the people say, like, it's not immoral because this chicken was dead and no harm was done to it. Whereas, and those are the weird people, right? And then half the people who are in Eastern side of the world have such a broader sense of community and religion that they're like, it doesn't matter if no one saw it. God still saw it. There's still some harm being done that maybe isn't as easy to see. So I think that part to me is interesting. And
I'm not clear exactly on that one, because it's playing with what weirds you out and grosses you out, and why does grossing you out equal morality in a lot of systems, which it does.
I wonder though if to bring it back to your points, Rosie and Faris, is that what if the chicken being dead is not necessarily the end of the story?
Right. Well, they cut off bits of it. They're like, no one sees him do it. No one has to eat it.
I don't want to know what they do with the chicken.
Maybe if you're in a certain culture, there's a certain sense that the soul of the chicken is somewhere, or there's karma, or there's reincarnation, or I don't know, whatever it might be. But I can see that it might play with more than just what you find squeamish or depraved. It has a consequence in the universe somewhere that you just happen to not see, right?
Yeah, but that's challenging. That gets you to a Janus position, right? Where you can't kill any bugs because you might destroy the universe, and so everything is sacred, which is difficult to manage in real life, unfortunately.
Yeah,
But
maybe it's about intention. That the intentionality of what you're doing, and anyway, I don't know. But it's
intention's very tricky, isn't it? Though, because it's a really tricky thing to ascribe someone like so. But yeah, but just before we get to that, because it's an interesting point, I do think Xavi's point about the pendulum of culture is kind of what we're talking about as well, right? The pendulum either orients towards rationality or to superstition often, and that orientation tends to be very helpful or not helpful depending on context, right? So
Yeah, and when you get to see, so we technologically, and of course in other fields we evolve, but there's still certain things that we go on and on and on and on again. So yeah, we killed God in the beginning of the 20th century, and there's still, and I think that now religion has more power than 20 years ago, and is in the moment that we got more access to information, and is the moment that we got access to more sources. We are the opinions are more plural and so on, but we gutted all this binge. It's too much, and when there's too much, we need some answers that sometimes it's not 2 + 2 = 4, or
Right.
it's like no, there must be something. And this is more like a personal thing, but I'm surprised still how there are certain things like identity, like nationalism, like things that you take. I don't know, 15 years ago, I took like, this is over. We can talk about something else, right? And now feels that identity is much more important than ever, and nationalism is growing again, and etc. 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 There's this fiction that is created, and people just embraces it in a weird way. For me, it's shocking. For example, in the United States, they still have the oath in front of a Bible. What the fuck are you doing? It's like that should not be allowed. That should not be allowed, because what about the Muslim people? And what about what if we build a country without the blessing of any ghost? And I'm sorry for being very straightforward with this, but can we just grow up a little bit? And that's something that I respect spiritual people, but cannot buy that. For me,
I love the idea that we as a society are constantly almost achieving civilization and never quite get there for the reasons that you described, right? I think what happened in the last century or so is that science failed us in narratological terms, to take it back to stories. Because like in Victorian times, science was going to solve everything, and everybody was very clear about this. It would explain what's going on. This happens, therefore this happens. It all makes sense. And then we get to Einstein, and science fractures. It breaks into completely non-comprehensible complexity theories that no one can understand, that explain nothing to anybody. And so we end up reaching for stories that make more sense to us, like, okay, God made it happen, because the idea of quantum mechanics doesn't make sense to anybody, even like quantum physicists. It doesn't make sense to them because it can't make sense. It's nonsensical. So it's like, it's not
which is great in a way.
Ourselves, right? It's not satisfying enough. Equally, like the forces of globalization are what I think are leading to nationalism. I think countries are stupid ideas. They're a bad scale of community to solve the problems that we face, right? At the global level, the big problems we face are climate change and tax avoidance, both of which are transnational problems that can't be solved by individual countries. And at the more local level, London problems are not Bristol problems, and countries don't solve those two sets of problems well collectively. So I'm like, countries done. I thought they'd go away, but the opposite happens. Everyone's like, I'm a transnational global nomad, like we are. And then Theresa May says, you're a citizen of nowhere, and we're going to lock down borders, and we're going to have, and you're like, oh, okay. Opposing forces just created, that whole thing. But
I'm interested at that idea of the bad consequences to the situation we're in that you're both talking to. But I'm thinking about the kind of the cycles that you've alluded to, that over the last 100 years, and then sort of for longer, and we go in and out. And then I start thinking about your Kurt Vonnegut story arcs, and where is this story ending? And I think about what you're talking about, Xavi, which is I think you said Dave Trott said it, but it's from The Third Man, isn't it? It's from the film The Third Man.
Mm-hmm.
And Orson Welles' character says it at the end about Switzerland and Italy, that there can be good things, great artistic things of meaning that come from great hurts and great pain and great and terrible events.
Absolutely.
And then I think you sort of you're bringing that thought is bringing together a couple of themes from the talks, which is that these things never end. We're always becoming civilization, then falling back away from it. But we're always producing good stuff from bad moments, and arguably the flip side is then true, that the seed of bad things is there, in our complacency during the good times as well. So there you've got another sort of opposite.
Yeah, no, and in a way, I
you
think
feel-
that when looking at the current times that we are living, and I'm talking about the last 10, 15 years, that gives me hope about, the fact that we are in such a shit place. Financial crisis, now a pandemic. Look at the beginning of the 20th century. The most interesting work was created between wars, and before the war, and right after the war, and and we're still on and on and on about this period that actually was very interesting. So in a way, and that's something that I tell my students, in a way, it's like, actually in the worst times is where more creative stuff and more advances you create as a society and in arts and so on. So because sometimes it's not that you don't have anything to lose, but you are kind of free when you have less to lose, when everything is fucked up. So I see a fantastic opportunity.
It creates massive disjunctures, but in this instance, are we talking about like Taylor Swift's album? Is that what we're talking about in terms of the great crisis art that's come out of this disaster? Because it's all right, it's fine.
It's a bit soon. It's a bit soon.
Okay,
I would say it's a bit soon, and I would say, and I was reading I read 2 books last year. I actually finished 2 books. One of them was by Stefan Zweig. I know that's terrible.
I really haven't been able to read either. It's just
right. So, and I finished Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, which I'd urge you to go and read. It's about exactly that time, Xavi, that you're talking about, and him. Remember, he was born in Vienna, and then he killed himself during the Second World War. He was Jewish, but he was looking back on the book is called The World of Yesterday. By the time he gets to the First World, the Great War, the First World War, the Europe that was delightful and cultured and producing all this amazing thing disappeared, and he realized the greatest vice of that quiet time was complacency. It's at the time of great virtue, complacency was the vice, and everything fell away. And then he has the coming out of it the other end, coming out of the Great War, all of this sort of upheaval and convulsive times, and great work kind of coming out of that too. Art that was just, insanely inventive and rejecting anything that was old and embracing anything that was new for the sake of being new. And that has about, 50% shit, 50% inspiration coming out of it. I'm sure that will happen, but let's not peg it on Taylor Swift yet.
I wonder how can I just like capture what Faris said on we're trying to get somewhere. There's some sort of end game. And you've all 4 mentioned, in effect, a combination of the line that moves. That it's not over yet. Are we in the middle? Are we in the start? Where are we? Are we going all over it again? And the idea of series of revisiting, series of adventures. So I'm going to present this. So as you were chiming along, sorry, what's in the mix? So he put all of this in a blender. Your 3 hot bananas in a blender. I present, again, this is just snippets from your conversations about it's, we had a story of like what happens to this horse, and like at which dot in the line are we looking at, and that, like what shape is it, what's the shape of this story. Xavi talks about Hoya and the etchings, and how again it's like funny how you have like the shades of he kind of contrasted it with like, oh, this is going to be dark now. Like it's like, ooh, like a dark, the up and down. And then the idea of James's gates, like, is it over? Have we reached the final destination? Or is it a gate? Is it an entrance, right? Is it, depending on where we are on this side, is it an exit? Is it an entrance? Where are we going? And is it over, right? So it's like so I present like that's just what it currently looks like in the blender. So and the answer, or the question may not have an answer. So dear students and other non-students, we're all students here. What happens next? I guess we'll find out, right? It's almost like, and to be continued, like a yes, and till next episode.
Yeah.
So thank you. It's just, yeah, I'm just offering that now for more conversation. And yeah, it's been quite an exciting topic of the not knowing. All 5 of us did not know what we were going to turn up to today, of what we were
No.
going to see. And it's amazing to see the connections, the similarities and differences.
2 etchings. I mean, what are the odds? But have you seen the TV show of The Watchmen?
Yes.
Right. That's a good show, isn't it?
Very good.
But there's a really important line in the comic book that they use, which is nothing ever ends.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of view of Dr. Manhattan, who exists atemporally throughout all of time, he experienced time non-linearly. And so the TV show tries to demonstrate what that's like, right? Nothing ever ends is a really important idea, because stories can't end. That's why we have stories. Lives end. The world usually doesn't, at least thus far. So we create stories to give it some sense of finality and consequence, right? But equally encoded with that, nothing ever ends, stuff inevitably carries forward. What's happening now is a direct consequence of what happened yesterday, and 100 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 1 billion years ago. And that's always true, which I think is fun to think about.
I agree. And I like that idea of I think it's bringing together the cycles that you talked about, Xavi, the where the story ends that you talked about, and then that idea of the gates, and just that every point of arrival is a point of departure as well.
Yes.
Which is the same thing that what you just said, but where you just don't know which one it is when you're there.
Yeah.
And there's these I don't know where I heard it, but this thing of that facing the future is a wrong way of verbalizing it, because you don't face the future, you are going towards the future backwards.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing is looking at the past.
That's
And
Caig,
then,
that's
because
Caig.
when
Yeah,
you're
no, I think
facing the
that's-
future, you can predict stuff, and that's completely false, right? You are heading into the future, but not looking at the future. You're looking at what happened in the past, and that's something that even when you talk to young people. And for example, we were talking about the possibility of a 4 day working week. Like, right, okay, but that it's like, guys, this is just an evolution of a certain of changes in the labor that have happened before. The fact that you are here in university and not working in the allotments into your 6. That's because these kind of things have evolved, but that's something that by not looking or by not understanding what happened is very difficult to push and not fall into the same mistakes over and over again. But maybe that's what makes us human, after all. Just
Right. Yeah.
getting wrong and wrong and wrong, and sometimes getting it right.
I'm thinking of, my mom has a tea towel that says, "I've learned so much from my mistakes. I'm thinking of making a few more of them."
I think
That's very good.
I think about where that where what Xavi said was sit on your vice virtue vice model, which is the sort of constantly being in the middle, having enough wisdom about what's come, but optimism about the future, And if you're either side of that line, you're probably kind of, you're either a know-it-all or you're completely naive, right? And I think that's quite a nice thing as well.
And Rosie and I discussed this quite a lot of late, where optimism is a non-realistic bias. Like, optimism is essentially a delusionary state that is necessary to be a human. Because and lots of tests demonstrate this, right? Depressive realism is quite real. Depressive people are much better at accurately gauging what's going to happen all of the time, because usually they're right. Optimists, however, get things wrong, but they also make the world move. And we need to be deluded enough to think that what we do matters and makes a difference, or we wouldn't do anything. And so all of us need to be deluded enough to get out of bed in the morning.
I think somewhere in there was that I make things happen.
Yes,
there was some sort of compliment hidden in the optimism bias.
Somewhere.
Yeah, well, the notion of binaries, like black and white, this or that, and the fact that we have to synthesize it, and it's part and parcel of the whole thing. In art terms, black and white are not considered colors. Again, obviously, it's just theory. But in one of the interpretations of what black and white is, they're called values. That values of absence of, presence of the other. Like how much there is absence of the other, and how much there is presence of the other, and the constant mix that keeps.
Yeah, that's cool.
We need to create or shades of. As ever, I have to kind of contain all of these, like this wisdom, and I'm incredibly grateful. Next week's topic, actually, weirdly, that we end with the gates, whether it's exit or entrance. Next week's topic is death. And and the previous week's topic was on body and other bodies, right? And which is why Virtues and Vice is like, what do we do with this material stuff? On the journeys that we go on. So challenge to you students and anyone who's watching this to say, what happens next? To be continued, ... So thank you again to James. Thank you, Xavi. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Faris, for joining this conversation. And it's been philosophical yet again, when we're just, we're meant to talk about virtues and vices, and yet we come up to just wondering, what is this meaning of life, and why are we making art? Why are we making art again? And
I was very, very tempted to talk about Miami Vice, but I thought it was a very odd pun.
You're showing your age. Only we will understand
again.
White suits,
rolled up sleeves. They were great, those.
And there we have it, our kind of ending of Virtues and Vices or not. The surprise is that this is but part 1 of Virtues and Vices, and we'll have part 2 of Virtues and Vices as well coming up. Thank you again to our special guests, and thank you for listening, and join us next week as we talk about what death means for creativity and for culture. So thank you, and till next time.